Alright, hello everyone, so today we're going to be talking about Keep It Simple 1d4, which in my opinion is one of the best 1d4 repertoires on the market right now. And so at the time of recording, it's been around for almost 3 years at the moment, but that being said, I've played this repertoire myself, and I'm pretty confident to say that given the lines in the repertoire that are recommended, it's not like a lot of other opening repertoires where sometimes the lines can be very sharp and theoretical, and they're just changing all the times. The lines recommended here are a lot less common, and hence they're less kind of prone to change, and I think they're going to serve many players well for the years to come. Also, it was written by I.M. Sielecki, who, if you don't know already, is a pretty strong international master who's written all sorts of content for Chessable, very good author, and as you could expect, this book is kind of no exception in the quality. And so with the repertoire, what is it recommending? If you don't know already, well basically we're going 1d4, and for most of the black responses here, for most conventional openings they could throw at us, we're going to respond with 2 knight-3 and 3 g3, aiming for this sort of fianchetto setup. And before I got this book, I have to say I knew this kind of variation or setup existed, but I never really took it too seriously. But after really going through this repertoire, I realized that there's a lot of potential in here, and a lot of lines which I previously thought were pretty harmless actually are more dangerous than a lot of players might be thinking, which is a big advantage for the people who play the system of white. Not to mention, but also, a lot of players on the black side probably have never studied this in their life before. They probably don't know any theory in these positions, and it's going to be really easy to get an advantage in the opening very often because of that, and also very likely an advantage on the clock, which is always a nice thing to have. So I myself have played this repertoire for about a year between 2019 and 2020, and every now and then I still play this kind of keep it simple 1d4 approach. But I want to show you guys one quick kind of excerpt from a game I played to really give you an understanding of how dangerous this opening can really be if you're not prepared. And it was against an Indian IM, I think GM now. At the time he was already kind of close to 2500, I was around 2200, so obviously a fairly big rating gap, and this was also the first time I was ever playing this keep it simple 1d4 stuff, so it was definitely a bit intimidating to say the least. But that being said, I managed to surprisingly get a very good position in the opening in this game, and already in this position after knight e5 here, it turned out the black, they have to be very careful. In the game my opponent just kind of blitzed out knight bd7 here, and if you'd like to try and pause the video and figure out why this isn't so good, I suggest you do so. But that being said, this was all covered in the chessboard course actually, and when he played this on the board I already knew like, oh okay, I know what to do here. So I played g4, bishop g6 and g5, and it's really cool here because if black moves the knight on f6 to square like e8, then they just hang d7. And if they take on e5, then we can play this intermediate move, not taking on e5 immediately, but taking on f6, and both the bishop and knight are hanging here, and so black is ultimately just going to be down a piece here, although they will have 2 pawns for it. And in the game I got this position, I have to say that although we are kind of up a piece here for 2 pawns, it's not that simple, and in the game I kind of end up messing things up, but purely from an opening perspective here, I already clearly had a very good position, and it just goes to show that even up to a very high level, this repertoire definitely packs a lot of poison. And so I'd love to really kind of give a broad kind of statistic for my results with the kind of keep it simple 1d4 approach over the board, but unfortunately I only played like probably 3 tournaments during the period where I was really playing this repertoire, so I didn't really have that many games to draw results from. But that being said, I played a decent amount of online games with this approach, probably around 200, 250 games, and I would say my results were somewhere between 65%, 70%, which is definitely a bit higher than my average score of white, and this could be due to the fact that I felt very comfortable in the positions, or maybe it was due to the fact that a lot of the times people just simply did not know what to do, and I think that that is the case that many of you guys will run into if you choose to play this repertoire. Compared to something more mainstream like here d4, d5 and c4, and your opponents have probably studied this before, whereas something like g3 here, a lot of people have never looked at in their life. And so now, as to the material of this book, one thing I'll say is that, once again, Sielecki, he always produces high quality content, and the explanations he gives in the book, very often he goes at length to describe the plans that you will be going for, your opponent's plans, and this all is really important in ultimately understanding the variations that you play in this repertoire. Not to mention that 1d4 has a lot of kind of tricky transpositions you need to be looking out for, unlike something like 1e4, and this is where Thieleke's attention to detail is very nice. He always points out potential transpositions, make sure that you're never going to be getting tricked out of book, and that's something I'm going to come to a bit later, but overall, very kind of good detail in the analysis. And so now getting into some real lines here of what I liked and what I didn't like so much, I will say first of all that in general, a lot of the lines where black plays e6, I like these lines quite a lot. Very often you're going to get some sort of setup here, black playing d5, and we're going to get a Catalan setup. Also, I should note that in a lot of these lines, eventually, although we're not playing c4 on move 2 like white often does in d4 openings, we're going to play c4 later on, which can very often transpose into more mainstream openings, such as a Catalan here. But one benefit that I actually liked very much was that, unlike say playing the Catalan through this move order, where after g3 here, you have to deal with all sorts of lines like d takes c4, bishop b4 check. When we play c4 only in this position, there's a lot less lines we have to deal with. Essentially, we only have to learn d takes c4 here, and c6 to close Catalan. And a lot of players who playing lines like bishop b4 check in this position, for example, they might actually not be so prepared for this kind of specific move order we throw at them, and so when we play c4 here, they're kind of like, oh crap, I don't really know what to do, I'm out of book. And also there were some other really interesting lines here that I learned with these e6 setups. For example, in this position here, there was some line like b5, which I actually learned to play with black because it's been recommended by a bunch of books. It's a very solid line, by the way. It was very interesting to kind of switch sides and really kind of learn about this position from a different perspective, and I learned that things weren't as simple as I thought they were with the black pieces. There are actually a lot of interesting resources that white has at their disposal. And I just wanted to show another game actually that I played against this pretty talented kid actually. I think he's like a FIDE master now. At the time he was around 2000 rated, but it was just kind of to show that even in these kind of rare sidelines, Thieleke really gives you some interesting analysis that you can use in your own games, like I did here, like after knight e3, e6, g3. Here my opponent plays a different sort of b5 setup, where they don't play d5, and this is something that I had very little experience in, but because of some of the analysis he gave here, I was able to use it to really good effect in this game here, where I played queen d3 here, one idea being that maybe I could take here on f6, and then play e4, gain space in the center, but d5 we see this here. And here, this is where a really interesting idea was given by Thieleke, and I had a chance to use it in my game here, where I took on f6, forcing bishop takes f6. Like, okay, you could play g takes f6, but then you get double pawns. Probably want to avoid that. So bishop takes f6, and here this really interesting idea was to play b4, using the fact that we've drawn the bishop away from this diagonal here, and now we can kind of clamp on the dark squares here, especially the c5 one. In the game, I got a pretty good position, I have to say, where I have this kind of bad dark squared bishop that I'm playing against, and I got a really nice positional advantage in the game. Eventually, things got to this rook ending where I had a big advantage, but unfortunately, in this specific game, despite the good position I got out of the opening, didn't manage to convert, had some sloppy technique, and eventually agreed to a draw. And so another one of the big setups that you're going to encounter a lot is, of course, going to be the King's Indian and Grunfeld stuff with g6. And I'd already been playing sort of the Fianchetto lines against Grunfeld and King's Indian for a while, where you go like knight f3 and g3 here. Kind of, it's very similar to what is recommended here, except in these lines, what the author recommends is after knight f3, g6, g3, bishop g7, and in the King's Indian here, where black plays d6, to not go c4, but actually to go b3. And honestly, if I were to reach this position, most of the time I would probably go c4, since I just prefer this. But that being said, b3 isn't entirely bad, and it does pack a lot of poison. The thing that really put me off these lines though were some more concrete lines where black can go e5 immediately, and okay, it looks like white might be able to win a pawn here, but it's a bit dangerous. There's some stuff here, like if you make this exchange here on d8 and then try to win a pawn here, there's knight g4, and this kind of pin here is very dangerous. You don't want to land yourself into this variation here. And like, okay, there's some stuff here like bishop a3, and the analysis continues. There's still a lot more to really uncover here. But personally, this stuff just kind of felt like it was getting a lot more tactical than I really wanted to for what I want to play against King's Indian. But that being said, a lot of people aren't going to have the balls to play e5 here, well, simply because they probably haven't studied this before, and instead they're going to play something like knight bd7 and try aim for like a more slow setup where they go rook e8 and c6, queen c7, and only then e5. And against these kind of setups, yeah, you're going to get an advantage very often, which is why this system is very effective. And I was looking at my results once again from my online games against the King's Indian, and from about like 50 games or so, my score was like 70% in this b3 line. So even though like I didn't really love it the most, I still have to say that from a practical perspective, I did do quite well with it. And also the Grunfeld is something that I've struggled a lot with over the years. It's always kind of been the opening where I never quite found a line that I like to play against it. But in some games against two international masters I faced, I got good positions in both of them. One of them playing this kind of more solid c6 setup, the other going for more like kind of sharp d takes d4. And in both games I got pretty good positions actually, but unfortunately in both games as well, I also managed to kind of screw them up later on in the game. Once again, kind of due to them being stronger players. Also, I wasn't in the best form. But that being said, some very kind of good analysis that he shows you here. But I have to say, some of the stuff I didn't like so much in this repertoire, at least kind of initially, were these lines where, after g3 here, black doesn't lock in their bishop with a move like e6 here, but instead they just develop it outside of the pawn chain with a move like bishop f5, or maybe even bishop g4, as we saw earlier in the first game I showed. And in general, I always felt that like these sort of positions where black just plays e6, c6, they get a very solid setup, and it's difficult for white to really pose many problems. I have to say though that once again, going through this repertoire really kind of showed me that that's a bit of a superficial assessment of such a position, and there's some really interesting stuff here, like this very particular move order where we don't castle here, but instead we go knight c3, and if move like bishop d6, which I very often face, you can see here that after queen b3, queen b6, you get c5. And this is a very kind of common response they would play anyway, even if they didn't play bishop d6, instead move like knight b7 maybe. But here it packs an extra punch because we're gaining this tempo on the bishop here, forcing it to move back. And then after b4 here, you can really see a very typical plan in action for white in this opening against bishop f5. We're going to try play b5 and make progress on the queen side like this. And here, black can't even really play b5 to stop that, because we can still play b5 actually, because after takes, there's this pin here on the rook, and this is very unpleasant for black to deal with. And another really cool idea actually was here, for example, with knight bd7, queen b3, queen b6, c5. Here, notice how the bishop isn't on d6, so black isn't necessarily forced to exchange queens here. They could instead play a move like queen a6, and then try to chip away at this pawn with a move like b6. And once again, going back earlier to how I was mentioning that white didn't castle yet, this is another interesting moment here where it really shows kind of how not castling could be beneficial. And here white can actually play bishop f1, taking sight at this queen on a6, preparing to play e4, a very dangerous discovered attack here. And this is something which I had the opportunity to play in many blitz games actually, which is really cool to play on the board, since it's not every day you get to play a move like bishop g2 and then moving it back to f1. Really fascinating idea, and there's plenty more like these in this repertoire. Also, another reason I really like this repertoire is something a lot of d4 repertoires don't do, is they do an absolutely terrible job of dealing with sidelines like g6 and d6, where you can very easily get tricked out of book. For example, very often a lot of repertoires against a Dutch defense will recommend to play something like bishop g5 or knight c3, which are known as kind of anti-Dutch variations. But the problem is, if you play lines like these against g6, if you try playing a move like c4 and now f5, you're kind of tricked out of book here, where black is essentially going to get a Leningrad Dutch, and you don't really get to play your same bishop g5 lines because you played c4, and that makes the positions a lot different. We'll see in Lecky's repertoire, he makes sure that everything is consistent, and against the Dutch he doesn't do things like recommend bishop g5, he stays very consistent with the theme of the repertoire, which is of course to play like knight f3 and g3, which of course is the main line against the Dutch and works kind of well with the whole setup of this repertoire. But that means also against stuff like g6 here, we're going to play knight f3 anyway. And so if black continues with the normal moves here, we play g3. And say if they did want to play Leningrad Dutch here, notice how we're not caught out of book. This is still kind of all going to plan. This is just part of the normal setup we play. We're not caught out of book or anything, which is very nice. So one common criticism I often hear about this keep it simple 1d4 repertoire, especially compared to keep it simple 1e4, is that people say this repertoire isn't simple at all. One reason being that there's like 1,000 trainable variations, which to me honestly, it's not that big of a deal. I understand some people might find that kind of very overwhelming. And another factor being that they say a lot of the positions in this repertoire feel very complicated, and to that I'd say not so sure how I'd agree. Maybe relatively speaking compared to keep it simple 1e4 it's complicated, but my kind of base of comparison is a bit different. I'm thinking like if you compare it to openings such as after d4 c4 here, and we go into the semi-Slav opening here, bishop g5, and we get this really sharp variation which is called the Botvinnik variation. Like, if this was a recommendation of this repertoire, then I'd say, yeah, this is not simple. But the stuff we see against the Slav here, we get these sort of endgame positions here, and there's just kind of a lot more of an emphasis on understanding. Like, this stuff is a lot more simple, I'd say, than going back to this. This is not simple, but this is not what the repertoire is recommending. I'd say, like, sure, there are some lines where stuff can get a little bit sharp, but you're never going to be able to completely avoid that in chess. If you do try and avoid that at all costs, essentially you're going to be robbing yourself of kind of some of what chess is really about, you know? Like, chess is a very rich game. Sometimes you're going to get these more positional games, and if you play a repertoire like this, that's going to be the majority of what you get. But every now and then, it's like, okay, if you get something more tactical, just deal with it, enjoy it, that's chess, right? But even if you do get positions like that, it's not like it's going to be these like super sharp variations that you'll gain outbooked in and that your opponent has studied before. That's not going to be the case at all. However, I do understand that some people still might kind of find those numbers like 1,000 trainable variations a bit overwhelming, and in general the positions they might just not understand. I'd already been playing d4 for a couple years and I have like 2200 FIDE rating, so for many people that might not be so relatable. But that being said, I think if you're like below 1700, 1800 over the board, maybe, and you're kind of feeling that this stuff is a bit discouraging, then maybe check out Keep It Simple 1e4 if you haven't already. I think that is a pretty solid repertoire to get started. So all in all, really like the book, has a lot of value to a lot of players of different levels, all the way up until like 2300 honestly, guys like 1600 as well can also get a lot out of this book. And it's worth reiterating, in my opinion, that a lot of players just will not be prepared for this knight f3 g3 setup in a lot of different lines, and it just has a lot of surprise value which can't be underestimated. In addition to the fact it's not just some like one trick opening, it has some legitimate kind of objective value in it. With that being said, I hope you liked the video. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and also leave a comment down below if you have any questions about this repertoire or any other kind of content you'd like to see in the future. But anyways, until next time, I will see you.